Years after her husband's death, a lonely widow finds a mysterious letter in the mail. What she learns about his secret life leaves her stunned and sets her on a crazy journey. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, her gaze fixed on the empty bird feeder swaying gently in the breeze. She made a mental note to fill it later, knowing how much joy the colorful visitors brought to her quiet mornings. The house felt cavernous around her, filled with memories, but devoid of the warmth it once held when John was alive. She shuffled to the coffee maker, her slippered feet whispering against the worn linoleum. The routine was always the same: coffee, toast, and a glance at the newspaper. It had been 5 years since John's passing, but Margaret still set out 2 mugs each morning, a habit she couldn't bring herself to break. As she waited for the coffee to brew, Margaret's eyes wandered over the familiar kitchen. The yellow curtains John had hated but tolerated because she loved them. The chipped mug on the windowsill, holding pens and pencils that they'd bought on their honeymoon. Every corner of the room held a piece of their life together. The coffee maker gurgled its last, and Margaret poured herself a cup. She added a splash of cream, watching it swirl and bloom in the dark liquid. John had always teased her about her coffee clouds, as he called them. The memory brought a sad smile to her lips. Margaret made her way to the living room, settling into her favorite armchair. The house creaked and settled around her, its sounds as familiar as her own heartbeat. She sipped her coffee and let her mind wander, as it often did, to the life she and John had built together. They'd met later in life, both in their 40s, at a mutual friend's barbecue. John had been charming, with a quick wit and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. Margaret, who had long since given up on the idea of marriage, found herself drawn to his warmth and gentle nature. Their courtship had been swift but sweet. Within a year, they were married, starting their life together in this very house. They'd had 15 wonderful years before cancer took John away, leaving Margaret alone with her memories and a house full of echoes. A sharp knock at the door startled Margaret from her reverie. She glanced at the clock, frowning slightly. It was too early for visitors, and she wasn't expecting anyone. Setting her coffee down, she made her way to the front door, smoothing her hair self-consciously. Opening the door, she found a young man in a postal uniform, holding a stack of envelopes. "Good morning, ma'am," he said with a friendly smile. "Got some mail for you." Margaret thanked him, taking the small bundle. Bills, most likely, and perhaps a catalog or two. She closed the door and began to sort through the envelopes as she walked back to her chair. Bill, advertisement, another bill, and then something caught her eye. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope addressed to John. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual for the occasional piece of mail for John to still find its way to their home, but something about this one felt different. The return address was unfamiliar, bearing the name of a law firm she'd never heard of. Margaret sat down heavily in her chair, the other mail forgotten on her lap. She turned the envelope over in her hands, running her fingers along the crisp edges. Should she open it? It was addressed to John, after all, but John was gone, and anything meant for him was now her responsibility to handle. With trembling hands, Margaret carefully opened the envelope. Inside, she found a single sheet of heavy paper, covered in formal letterhead. Her eyes scanned the first few lines, and she felt the world tilt beneath her. "Dear Mr. Thompson," it began, "I regret to inform you that your former wife, Elizabeth Carter, has passed away." Margaret's vision blurred. Former wife. John had never mentioned being married before. They had shared everything, hadn't they? She had thought she knew every part of his life, every joy and sorrow. As she continued reading, her coffee grew cold, forgotten on the side table. The letter spoke of legal matters, of a child from this previous marriage, of responsibilities and obligations. Margaret's mind reeled, trying to reconcile this new information with the man she had loved and thought she knew completely. The room seemed to close in around her, the familiar surroundings suddenly feeling alien and cold. Margaret clutched the letter to her chest, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. How could John have kept this from her, What else didn't she know? As the initial shock began to subside, a determination took root in Margaret's heart. She needed answers, and she knew she wouldn't find them sitting in this chair, surrounded by memories that now felt tainted by doubt. With a deep breath, Margaret stood up, letter in hand. It was time to uncover the truth about the man she had loved, the man she thought she knew. Margaret's heart raced as she approached the quaint suburban home. The address matched the one she had scribbled down from the lawyer's letter. This was it, the home of Sarah, John's daughter from his previous marriage. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. The front yard was well maintained, with colorful flowers lining the walkway. Margaret couldn't help but wonder if John had ever walked this path, if he had watched his daughter grow up in this very house. The thought made her chest tighten with a mix of sadness and lingering betrayal. She hesitated at the door, her hand poised to knock. What would she say? How would Sarah react? Margaret had rehearsed this moment countless times during her journey, but now that she was here, all her prepared words seemed to evaporate. Before she could change her mind, Margaret rapped gently on the door. Seconds ticked by, feeling like an eternity. Then the sound of approaching footsteps from inside. The door swung open, revealing a young woman in her early 30s. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Sarah was the spitting image of John. The same warm brown eyes, the same gentle curve of the mouth. It was like looking at a ghost. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Margaret swallowed hard. "Hello, Sarah. My name is Margaret Thompson. I was John's wife." Sarah's eyes widened in confusion. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. My father wasn't married. He passed away when I was very young." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. John hadn't just kept his first family a secret from her. He had kept her a secret from them as well. The depth of his deception was staggering. "May I come in?" Margaret asked softly. "I think we have a lot to talk about." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded, stepping aside to let Margaret enter. The living room was cozy, filled with family photos. Margaret's eyes were drawn to a picture of a much younger John, holding a toddler Sarah in his arms. Her heart ached at the sight. They sat down, an awkward silence stretching between them. Margaret clutched her purse, where she had tucked away the lawyer's letter and some photos of her life with John. "I know this must be a shock," Margaret began. "It was for me too. I only learned about you and your mother a few days ago, when I received a letter meant for John." Sarah's brow furrowed. "But that's impossible. My father died when I was 3. My mom raised me alone until she passed away last month." Margaret's mind reeled. The timeline didn't make sense. "Sarah, when exactly did you think your father died?" "In 1990, Sarah replied, her voice wavering slightly. "There was an accident. At least, that's what my mom always told me." Margaret shook her head slowly. "Sarah, I'm so sorry, but that's not true. John was very much alive. We met in 2003 and were married for 15 years before he passed away from cancer 5 years ago." Sarah's face paled, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. "No, that can't be right. My mom wouldn't have lied to me. Not about something like that." With trembling hands, Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a photo album. She opened it to a picture of her and John on their wedding day, his smile radiant as he looked at her. "This was taken in 2004, she said softly, passing the album to Sarah. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she stared at the photo. Her fingers traced the outline of John's face. "He looks older, but it's him. It's really him." Her voice broke. "He was alive all this time?" Margaret nodded, her own eyes welling up. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I had no idea about you or your mother. John never mentioned having another family." Sarah looked up, her expression a mix of pain and anger. "He abandoned us. He left us and started a new life with you." "I don't know why he did what he did," Margaret said gently. "But I do know that the man I married was kind and loving. There must be more to this story than we know." Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "This is too much. I need some time to process this. Margaret rose as well, understanding the young woman's turmoil. Of course, I'll leave you my contact information. When you're ready to talk more, please reach out to me. As Margaret turned to leave, Sarah's voice stopped her. Wait, I have so many questions. About him, about your life together. I don't know if I'm ready to hear it all, but could you tell me one thing? Was he happy? Margaret looked back at Sarah, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. Yes, she said softly. He was very happy. But now I wonder if that happiness was always tinged with the regret of leaving you behind. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. As Margaret left the house, she felt the weight of John's secrets pressing down on her. She had come seeking answers, but instead found a young woman whose life had been shaped by the same lies that now threatened to unravel Margaret's own past. The truth was out now, for better or worse. What came next would depend on both of them, as they navigated the complicated legacy John had left behind. Margaret sat in her rental car, parked across the street from Sarah's house. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. She had been sitting there for nearly an hour, gathering the courage to approach the door. The weight of the truth she carried felt almost unbearable. Taking a deep breath, Margaret finally stepped out of the car. The suburban street was quiet, with only the distant sound of a lawnmower breaking the silence. As she walked up the path to Sarah's front door, Margaret couldn't help but notice the well-tended flower beds and the cheerful, welcome mat. It all seemed so normal, so unaware of the bombshell she was about to drop. Margaret's finger hovered over the doorbell for a moment before she finally pressed it. The chime echoed inside the house, followed by the sound of approaching footsteps. The door opened, revealing a young woman with familiar brown eyes. John's eyes. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, her voice polite but cautious. Margaret swallowed hard. "Hello, Sarah. My name is Margaret Thompson. I was John's wife." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. My father wasn't married when he died. He passed away when I was very young." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Not only had John kept his first family a secret from her, but he had also erased his entire life with Margaret from his past. The depth of his deception was staggering. "May I come in?" Margaret asked softly. "I think we have a lot to talk about." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded, stepping aside to let Margaret enter. The living room was cozy, filled with family photos. Margaret's eyes were drawn to a picture of a much younger John, holding a toddler Sarah in his arms. Her heart ached at the sight. They sat down, an awkward silence stretching between them. Margaret clutched her purse where she had tucked away the lawyer's letter and some photos of her life with John. "I know this must be a shock," Margaret began. "It was for me too. I only learned about you and your mother a few days ago, when I received a letter meant for John." Sarah's expression was a mix of confusion and disbelief. "But that's impossible. My father died over 30 years ago. There must be some mistake." Margaret shook her head slowly. "I'm afraid there's no mistake, Sarah. John was very much alive until 5 years ago. We were married for 15 years before he passed away from cancer." Sarah's face paled, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. "No, that can't be right. My mom wouldn't have lied to me. Not about something like that." With trembling hands, Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a photo album. She opened it to a picture of her and John on their wedding day, his smile radiant as he looked at her. "This was taken in 2004, she said softly, passing the album to Sarah. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she stared at the photo. Her fingers traced the outline of John's face. "He looks older, but it's him. It's really him." Her voice broke. "He was alive all this time?" Margaret nodded, her own eyes welling up. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I had no idea about you or your mother. John never mentioned having another family." Sarah looked up, her expression a mix of pain and anger. He left us. He started a new life and never looked back. I don't know why he did what he did, Margaret said gently, but I do know that the man I married was kind and loving. There must be more to this story than we know. Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing the room. This is too much. I need some time to process this. Margaret rose as well, understanding the young woman's turmoil. Of course, I'll leave you my contact information. When you're ready to talk more, please reach out to me. As Margaret turned to leave, Sarah's voice stopped her. Wait, I have so many questions. About him, about your life together. I don't know if I'm ready to hear it all, but could you tell me one thing? Was he happy? Margaret looked back at Sarah, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. Yes, she said softly. He was very happy. But now I wonder if that happiness was always tinged with regret. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. As Margaret left the house, she felt the weight of John's secrets pressing down on her. She had come seeking answers, but instead found a young woman whose life had been shaped by the same lies that now threatened to unravel Margaret's own past. The truth was out now, for better or worse. What came next would depend on both of them, as they navigated the complicated legacy John had left behind. Margaret walked back to her car, her mind swirling with questions and emotions. She knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey for both her and Sarah. As she drove away, Margaret couldn't help but glance back at Sarah's house in her rearview mirror. She had a feeling she would be seeing a lot more of it in the coming days and weeks. The road ahead was uncertain, but Margaret was determined to see it through, for her own sake and for Sarah's. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret found herself constantly checking her phone, hoping for a message from Sarah. The silence was deafening, filled with unanswered questions and unspoken words. Margaret tried to go about her daily routine, but her mind always wandered back to that fateful meeting. One crisp autumn morning, as Margaret was tending to her garden, her phone buzzed. Her heart leaped when she saw Sarah's name on the screen. The message was brief. Can we meet? There's a cafe on Maple Street called The Cozy Corner. Tomorrow at 2 p.m.? Margaret's fingers trembled as she typed her reply, agreeing to the meeting. She spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous anticipation, rehearsing what she might say, wondering what Sarah wanted to discuss. The next day, Margaret arrived at the cafe early, choosing a quiet corner table. She ordered a cup of tea, more to have something to do with her hands than out of any real desire to drink it. As the minutes ticked by, she found herself studying every face that walked through the door. At precisely 2 p.m., Sarah entered. She looked tired with dark circles under her eyes, but there was a determined set to her jaw. She spotted Margaret and made her way over, sliding into the seat across from her. "Thank you for coming," Sarah said, her voice soft but steady. Margaret nodded, offering a small smile. "I'm glad you reached out. How are you doing?" Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Honestly, I'm not sure. It's been a lot to process. I've been going through old photos, old memories, trying to make sense of it all." The waitress came by and Sarah ordered a coffee. There was a moment of awkward silence before she spoke again. "I have so many questions, but I don't even know where to start." Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a small photo album. "I thought you might like to see these. They're pictures from my life with John, our life together." Sarah hesitated for a moment before taking the album. She opened it slowly, her eyes widening as she took in the images. There was John, older than she remembered but unmistakably her father, smiling at the camera in various settings, at home, on vacation, at parties with friends. "He looks happy," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded. "He was. We had a good life together. But Sarah, I want you to know that if I had any idea about you, about his past, I would have insisted he reach out to you." Sarah looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Did he ever mention me? Or my mom?" Margaret shook her head sadly. "No, he didn't. And I'm so sorry for that." I've been racking my brain, trying to remember if there were ever any clues, any hints about his past life, but there was nothing. Sarah's hands clenched around her coffee mug. I don't understand how he could just leave, start over as if we never existed. I don't understand it either, Margaret admitted. The John I knew was kind, loving, and honest. Or at least, I thought he was honest. Now, I'm not sure I ever really knew him at all. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in their thoughts. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice stronger. I've been doing some digging. I found some old papers of my mom's. There were letters. It seems like their relationship was complicated, more complicated than I ever knew. Margaret leaned forward, her interest piqued. What do you mean? Sarah took a deep breath. From what I can gather, they were young when they got married. Too young, maybe. The letters suggest there were problems. Nothing specific, but reading between the lines, they were unhappy. Margaret nodded slowly, processing this new information. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it might help explain it. People sometimes make desperate choices when they're unhappy. I suppose, Sarah said, though she didn't sound convinced. But to fake his own death? To abandon his child? I'm not sure I can ever forgive that. Margaret reached across the table, gently placing her hand on Sarah's. You don't have to forgive him. Your feelings are valid, Sarah. What he did was wrong, no matter the reasons behind it. Sarah didn't pull away from Margaret's touch. Instead, she looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. Thank you for being here, for sharing this with me. I know this can't be easy for you either. Margaret smiled softly. We're in this together now. Sarah, whatever comes next, whatever we discover about John and his choices, we'll face it together. If you want to, that is. Sarah nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I'd like that. I think I need that. As they continued to talk, sharing stories and piecing together the puzzle of John's life, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but at least now, neither of them had to walk it alone. In the weeks following their cafe meeting, Margaret and Sarah fell into a routine of regular phone calls and occasional visits. Their conversations, initially stilted and filled with awkward pauses, gradually became more comfortable as they navigated their shared connection to John. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Margaret found herself once again at Sarah's doorstep. This time, instead of trepidation, she felt a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Sarah had mentioned finding a box of old documents in her mother's attic, and they had agreed to go through them together. Sarah greeted Margaret with a small smile, ushering her into the living room where a dusty cardboard box sat on the coffee table. I haven't looked through it yet, Sarah explained, settling onto the couch. I wanted us to do this together. Margaret nodded, taking a seat beside her. I appreciate that, Sarah. Are you ready? With a deep breath, Sarah opened the box. Inside were stacks of yellowed papers, old photographs, and what looked like a journal. They began sorting through the items, creating piles on the coffee table. As they worked, Margaret couldn't help but notice how Sarah's hands trembled slightly when handling certain items. She was about to suggest taking a break when Sarah gasped, holding up a faded photograph. Look at this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret leaned in to see. The photo showed a much younger John, his arm around a pretty young woman who must have been Sarah's mother. They were smiling, but there was something in their eyes, a tension, perhaps, or a sadness that belied their happy poses. They look so young, Margaret murmured. Sarah nodded. Mom always said they were high school sweethearts, but looking at this, they don't seem as happy as I always imagined them to be. As they continued to sift through the box, a clearer picture began to emerge. There were letters exchanged between John and Sarah's mother, Elizabeth, revealing a relationship that had started with youthful passion, but quickly became strained under the pressures of early marriage and parenthood. One letter in particular caught their attention. It was from John to Elizabeth, dated just a few months before his supposed death. Margaret read it aloud, her voice soft. Liz, I can't do this anymore. We're not happy, and we both know it. I feel like I'm suffocating, like I'm losing myself. I love Sarah more than anything, but I don't know how to be the father she deserves when I can barely keep myself together. Maybe it would be better if I just... The letter trailed off there, the rest of the page torn away. Sarah's hands were shaking as she took the letter from Margaret. He was planning to leave even then, she said, her voice a mix of anger and pain. Margaret placed a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. It seems like he was struggling a lot. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it helps explain it, Sarah finished, wiping away a tear. I always thought they were so in love, that we were this perfect little family until the accident. But it was all a lie. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the revelation hanging heavy in the air. Then Sarah reached for the journal they had set aside earlier. This is my mom's, she said. I've never read it before. I'm not sure I want to, but we don't have to do everything today, Margaret said gently. This is a lot to process. Sarah shook her head. No, I need to know. We need to know. As they began to read through Elizabeth's journal entries, a complex picture emerged of a young woman struggling with depression, feeling trapped in a marriage that had lost its spark. There were mentions of arguments, of John staying out late, of Elizabeth's fears that she wasn't a good enough mother. One entry, dated a week before John's disappearance, stood out. John's been talking about leaving again. I can't bear the thought of raising Sarah alone, but I can't keep living like this either. Sometimes I think we'd all be better off if he just disappeared. Margaret and Sarah exchanged a look of shock. Do you think... Sarah began, unable to finish the thought. Margaret shook her head. We can't jump to conclusions, but it does seem like there was more going on than either of us realized. As the afternoon wore on, they continued to piece together the puzzle of John and Elizabeth's troubled relationship. The picture that emerged was far from the perfect family Sarah had always imagined, but it also wasn't as simple as a man abandoning his family on a whim. When they finally took a break, both women were emotionally drained. Sarah made them some tea, and they sat in contemplative silence, sipping from their mugs. Thank you for doing this with me, Sarah said after a while. I don't think I could have faced all this alone. Margaret reached out and squeezed Sarah's hand. You're not alone anymore. We're in this together, remember? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room, Margaret and Sarah knew they had only scratched the surface of John's complicated past, but they also knew that whatever truths they uncovered, they would face them together. The following weeks saw Margaret and Sarah delving deeper into John's past, piecing together the puzzle of his life. They spent countless hours poring over old documents, making phone calls, and even visiting John's hometown in search of answers. One crisp autumn afternoon, they found themselves in the local library of John's childhood town. The musty smell of old books filled the air as they hunched over microfiche readers, scanning through decades-old newspaper articles. Look at this, Sarah whispered, pointing to a grainy image on the screen. It was a high school newspaper clipping featuring a young John, grinning widely as he held up a trophy. Debate team champion, she read aloud, a hint of pride in her voice. Margaret leaned in, studying the image. He never mentioned being on the debate team, she mused. There's so much we didn't know about him. As they continued their research, a clearer picture of John's early life began to emerge. He had been a bright, ambitious student with dreams of becoming a lawyer. But somewhere along the way, those dreams had been derailed. They were about to call it a day when Sarah stumbled upon another article that made her gasp. Margaret, look at this, she said, her voice trembling slightly. The article, dated a few months before John's marriage to Elizabeth, detailed a car accident involving a young John Thompson. He had been the driver, and while he escaped with minor injuries, his passenger, a close friend, had been seriously hurt. I had no idea, Margaret murmured, her heart heavy. This must have affected him deeply. Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the article. It says here that he was cleared of any wrongdoing, but can you imagine carrying that guilt? As they left the library, both women were lost in thought. The John they were discovering was far more complex than either had imagined. A man haunted by past mistakes, struggling with the weight of expectations and responsibilities. They decided to grab a late lunch at a small diner across the street. As they settled into a booth, Sarah broke the silence. "I've been thinking," she said, fidgeting with her napkin. "Maybe we should try to find some of Dad's old friends, see if they can tell us more about what he was like back then." Margaret nodded, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "That's a good idea. There might be people who knew him during those years between the accident and when he left." Their food arrived and they ate in companionable silence for a while. Margaret couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. What had started as a shocking revelation had turned into an unexpected partnership, a shared quest for understanding. "You know," Sarah said, pushing her plate aside, "I used to dream about my dad coming back when I was a kid. I'd imagine all these scenarios where he'd show up one day, explain that it had all been a big mistake." Margaret reached across the table, squeezing Sarah's hand. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I can't imagine how hard that must have been for you." Sarah gave a sad smile. "The thing is, now that I know the truth, I'm not sure which is worse, thinking he was dead or knowing he chose to leave." "It's okay to feel conflicted," Margaret assured her. "What John did, it's not something that's easy to reconcile." As they finished their meal and prepared to head back to their respective homes, Sarah turned to Margaret with a determined look. "I want you to know, I'm glad we're doing this together. Even though it's hard, even though we're uncovering things that are painful, I feel like I'm finally getting to know my father, and I'm getting to know you too." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. "I feel the same way, Sarah. I know this isn't how either of us imagined our lives would turn out, but I'm grateful for the connection we've formed." They parted ways with a hug, promising to touch base in a few days to plan their next steps. As Margaret drove home, her mind whirled with all they had discovered. The John she had known and loved was still there in her memories, but now she saw him with new eyes, a man who had carried deep wounds and made difficult choices. She realized that this journey wasn't just about uncovering John's past. It was about forging a new future, a future where she and Sarah could support each other, where they could find healing in their shared experiences. As the sun set on another day of discovery, Margaret felt a mix of emotions: sadness for the pain John had carried, anger at his choices, but also a growing sense of peace. Whatever else they might uncover, she knew that she and Sarah would face it together, two women united by an unexpected bond, navigating the complex legacy John had left behind. The crisp autumn air nipped at Margaret's cheeks as she stood outside Sarah's house, a folder tucked under her arm. She took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell, steeling herself for what was to come. Today, they were going to dive into the most challenging part of their investigation yet, reaching out to John's old acquaintances. Sarah opened the door, her face a mix of anticipation and apprehension. "Come in," she said, ushering Margaret inside. "I've made some coffee. I think we're going to need it." They settled in the living room, which had become their unofficial headquarters over the past few weeks. The coffee table was strewn with papers, photos, and notebooks filled with their findings. Margaret pulled out the folder she'd brought. "I managed to track down a few names and numbers," she said, spreading out a list. "Old classmates, colleagues from his first job, even his debate team coach." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the names. "It feels strange, doesn't it? Like we're about to talk to people who knew a completely different version of my dad." "I know what you mean," Margaret agreed. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Sarah took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be. Who should we start with?" They decided to begin with John's high school debate coach, Mr. Harrison. Margaret dialed the number, her hand shaking slightly as she put the phone on speaker. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered. "Hello?" Margaret cleared her throat. Mr. Harrison, my name is Margaret Thompson. I'm calling about a former student of yours, John Thompson. There was a pause on the other end. John Thompson. Now that's a name I haven't heard in years. What's this about? Margaret glanced at Sarah before continuing. We're trying to piece together some information about John's past. We were hoping you might be able to tell us what he was like in high school. Mr. Harrison chuckled. John Thompson. He was one of the brightest students I ever had. Quick-witted, charismatic, could argue his way out of anything. I always thought he'd end up a hotshot lawyer or politician. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes wide. Did you keep in touch with him after he graduated? For a while, Mr. Harrison replied. He'd stop by when he was in town, but then, well, life happens. People drift apart. They chatted for a few more minutes, gleaning tidbits about John's high school years, his ambitions, his friendships, his knack for public speaking. As they hung up, Sarah sat back, a thoughtful expression on her face. He sounds so different from the dad I knew, she murmured. It's like we're talking about two different people. Margaret nodded, jotting down some notes. People change, Sarah. Life has a way of reshaping us. They moved on to the next name on the list, a former colleague from John's first job out of college. This time, Sarah made the call. Hello, is this Tom Reeves? I'm calling about John Thompson. He used to work with you at Midwest Insurance. Tom's voice was hesitant. Yeah, I remember John. It's been, must be over 30 years now. What's this about? Sarah took a deep breath. I'm his daughter. I'm trying to learn more about him, about who he was before. There was a long pause. His daughter? I didn't know John had a kid. Look, I'm not sure what to tell you. John was a good guy, hard worker, but he always seemed, I don't know, restless maybe, like he was looking for something more. As they continued their calls throughout the afternoon, a pattern began to emerge. Everyone remembered John as bright, ambitious, and likable, but there was also a recurring theme of restlessness, of a man who never seemed quite satisfied with where he was in life. By the time they made their last call, both Margaret and Sarah were emotionally drained. They sat in silence for a while, processing everything they'd learned. It's strange, Sarah finally said. I feel like I know him better now, but at the same time, he seems even more of a mystery. Margaret nodded, understanding exactly what Sarah meant. It's like we're putting together a jigsaw puzzle, but we're still missing some crucial pieces. Sarah stood up, stretching. I need some air. Want to take a walk? They strolled through Sarah's neighborhood, the setting sun painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. As they walked, they discussed their next steps, the new questions that had arisen from their day of discovery. You know, Margaret said as they rounded a corner, I keep thinking about something Mr. Harrison said, about how John could argue his way out of anything. Sarah nodded. You think that's how he justified leaving? By convincing himself it was the right thing to do? Maybe, Margaret mused. Or maybe he spent the rest of his life trying to argue with his own conscience. As they headed back to Sarah's house, both women felt the weight of the day's revelations. They had learned so much, yet still had so many questions. But as they said their goodbyes, there was also a sense of progress, of moving forward together on this complex journey of discovery. Margaret drove home, her mind whirling with all they had uncovered. The John she had known was still there in her memories, but now she saw him as part of a larger, more complicated story. A story that she and Sarah were slowly, painstakingly piecing together. One phone call, one memory, one revelation at a time. The soft glow of the laptop screen illuminated Margaret's face as she scrolled through old social media profiles. It was late, well past midnight, but sleep eluded her. The day's discoveries had left her mind buzzing with questions and possibilities. A gentle knock on her bedroom door startled her. "Come in," she called softly. Sarah poked her head in, looking as sleepless as Margaret felt. They had decided it would be easier if Sarah stayed over for a few days while they continued their investigation. "Can't sleep either?" Sarah asked, patting into the room. Margaret shook her head, patting the bed beside her. Sarah climbed up, peering at the laptop screen. "What are you looking at?" "I found some old profiles," Margaret explained. "Look at this one. It's from right around the time John and I met." They leaned in together, studying the page. It was sparse with only a few posts and photos, but it offered a glimpse into John's life just before he'd entered Margaret's world. There were vague status updates about new beginnings and fresh starts, a photo of a moving truck. Sarah's finger traced the screen, pointing to a comment on one of the posts. "Who's Mark Stevens?" "He seems to know Dad pretty well." Margaret frowned, trying to recall. "I don't remember John ever mentioning him, but look at how he's talking. It's like they were close friends." They spent the next hour combing through the profile, noting down names and dates. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, they finally closed the laptop, both exhausted but oddly energized. "We should try to contact this Mark person," Sarah suggested, stifling a yawn. "He might be able to fill in some gaps." Margaret nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "Let's get some sleep first. We'll start fresh in the morning." As they parted ways, each to their own room, Margaret felt a surge of affection for Sarah. This shared quest had brought them closer than she ever could have imagined. Despite the pain and confusion of uncovering John's past, there was a silver lining in the bond they were forming. A few hours later, after a brief but necessary nap, they reconvened in the kitchen. Over strong coffee and toast, they plotted their next move. "I did some digging," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "I think I found Mark Stevens on social media. He lives about an hour from here." Margaret peered at the profile picture Sarah was showing her. The man looked vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place why. Should we reach out to him, or would it be better to visit in person? They debated the pros and cons, finally deciding that a face-to-face meeting would be best. Sarah sent a message explaining their situation in broad strokes and asking if Mark would be willing to meet. To their surprise, a response came almost immediately. Mark agreed to meet them that afternoon at a local cafe. The drive to the cafe was filled with nervous anticipation. What would Mark reveal? Would he be able to shed light on the years John had kept hidden? As they pulled into the parking lot, Margaret spotted a man matching Mark's profile picture sitting at an outdoor table. He stood as they approached, his face a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Sarah?" "Margaret," he asked, extending his hand. "I'm Mark. I have to say, your message came as quite a shock." They settled at the table, ordering coffees to ease the tension. Mark studied them both, his brow furrowed. "I'm not sure how much help I can be," he began. "John and I were close once, but we lost touch years ago." Sarah leaned forward, her voice earnest. "Anything you can tell us would be helpful. We're just trying to understand." Mark nodded, taking a deep breath. "John and I met in college. We were roommates, became fast friends. He was different back then, full of big dreams, always talking about changing the world." As Mark spoke, a picture began to form of a young John, idealistic, ambitious, but also troubled. He spoke of late-night conversations where John would express doubts about his path in life, about the pressures he felt to live up to others' expectations. "The last time I saw him," Mark said, his voice growing soft, "was just before he married Elizabeth, Sarah's mother. He seemed conflicted, happy but also scared, I think. After that, it was like he vanished. I tried reaching out, but he never responded." Margaret and Sarah exchanged glances. This aligned with what they had pieced together so far, but it also raised new questions. "Did he ever mention starting over?" Margaret asked carefully. "Or leaving his old life behind?" Mark's eyes widened slightly. "Not in so many words, but there was this one night, after a few too many beers. He talked about how easy it would be to just disappear, become someone new. I thought he was just talking nonsense, but now, as the afternoon wore on, they continued to probe Mark's memories, each revelation adding another piece to the complex puzzle of John's life. By the time they said their goodbyes, both Margaret and Sarah felt emotionally drained, but also oddly invigorated. On the drive home, they were quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I think I understand him a little better now," she said softly. "I'm not saying I forgive him, but I think I get why he felt trapped." Margaret reached over, squeezing Sarah's hand. "Understanding is a good first step. We're getting there, one piece at a time." As they pulled into Margaret's driveway, the setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn. They had uncovered so much, yet still had so far to go. But as they walked into the house together, there was a sense of solidarity, of shared purpose. Whatever truths lay ahead, they would face them together. The crisp autumn air filled Margaret's lungs as she and Sarah walked through the local park. Leaves crunched beneath their feet, a symphony of reds and golds surrounding them. They had taken to these walks as a way to process their discoveries, finding solace in the quiet beauty of nature. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about everything we've learned, about Dad, about us." Margaret nodded encouragingly, sensing Sarah had more to say. "It's strange," Sarah continued, her breath visible in the cool air. "A few months ago, I thought I knew who my father was. Now, it's like I'm getting to know him all over again, through your eyes and the eyes of others." They paused at a bench overlooking a small pond, sitting down to watch the ducks glide across the water's surface. "I feel the same way," Margaret admitted. "The John I knew was only part of the story. It's like we're putting together a jigsaw puzzle, but the picture keeps changing." Sarah smiled wryly. "A puzzle with some pieces missing and others that don't quite fit." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The investigation had taken them down unexpected paths, revealing a John Thompson who was far more complex than either had imagined. "You know," Margaret said softly, "despite everything we've uncovered, I still love him. Is that wrong?" Sarah shook her head. "No, I don't think so. I'm still angry at him for leaving, for lying, but I also understand him better now. He was flawed, human, just like all of us." As they resumed their walk, Sarah broached a topic they'd been dancing around for weeks. "I've been wondering, what do we do with all this information? Do we keep it to ourselves, or do we share it somehow?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I think that's something we need to decide together. There are other people who might be affected by what we've learned. Your mother's family, John's old friends." They discussed the pros and cons as they completed their circuit of the park. Sharing the truth could bring closure to some, but it might also open old wounds. It was a delicate balance to consider. As they neared Margaret's house, Sarah stopped suddenly. "I have an idea," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "What if we wrote a book? Not to expose Dad or air dirty laundry, but to tell a story about family, forgiveness, and finding connection in unexpected places." Margaret felt a spark of inspiration at the suggestion. "That's actually a wonderful idea. We could focus on our journey, on how uncovering the past helped us build a relationship in the present." They spent the rest of the evening brainstorming, their enthusiasm growing with each passing hour. The idea of the book gave their investigation a new purpose, a way to transform their pain and confusion into something meaningful. As night fell, they sat in Margaret's cozy living room, laptops open and notepads filled with ideas. The story was taking shape before their eyes, a tale of two women brought together by a shared loss, embarking on a journey of discovery that would change them both. "You know," Sarah said, looking up from her notes, "I never expected any of this when I first met you. I was so angry, so hurt. But now, Margaret reached out, squeezing Sarah's hand. I know, I feel the same way. It's like John gave us one last gift, each other. Tears glistened in Sarah's eyes as she nodded. I think I'm ready to forgive him. Not forget, but forgive. Is that crazy? Not at all, Margaret assured her. Forgiveness doesn't mean excusing what he did. It means choosing to let go of the anger, to move forward. As they worked late into the night, shaping their story, both women felt a sense of peace settling over them. The journey had been difficult, filled with painful revelations and challenging truths, but it had also brought healing, understanding, and an unexpected bond. Margaret looked at Sarah, this young woman who had become like a daughter to her, and felt a surge of gratitude. Whatever John's reasons for his choices, he had connected them in a way neither could have anticipated. As they finally called it a night, Margaret walked Sarah to the guest room. Thank you, she said softly, for being willing to take this journey with me. Sarah hugged her tightly. Thank you for being there every step of the way. They parted, each to their own room, but united in purpose and in heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began to write their story, but they would face them together, two women bound by a shared past and looking forward to a future they were creating, one word at a time. The soft glow of the afternoon sun filtered through the bookstore windows as Margaret and Sarah stood side by side, their hearts racing with anticipation. Before them, a table was piled high with copies of their newly published book, The Threads That Bind Us, A Journey of Discovery and Forgiveness. It had been 2 years since they first embarked on their quest to uncover John's past, and now their story was ready to be shared with the world. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had brought them closer than either could have imagined. As people began to file into the store for the book signing, Margaret squeezed Sarah's hand. Are you ready for this? She asked softly. Sarah nodded, a mix of nervousness and excitement in her eyes. As ready as I'll ever be. It's strange, isn't it? Sharing our story with strangers. It is, Margaret agreed. But if it helps even one person find healing or understanding, it'll be worth it. They took their seats, greeting readers and signing books. Some people shared their own stories of family secrets and reconciliation, moved by Margaret and Sarah's journey. Others simply expressed admiration for their courage in confronting the past. As the event wound down, a familiar face appeared in the line. It was Mark Stevens, John's old college friend. He approached the table, a copy of the book clutched in his hands. I just wanted to say, he began, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Reading your story, it helped me understand John better, and it's given me the courage to reconnect with my own estranged family. Margaret and Sarah exchanged a glance, both feeling a sense of validation. This was exactly why they had decided to share their story. Later that evening, as they celebrated the successful launch over dinner, Sarah raised her glass in a toast. To John, she said, her voice steady, for all his flaws, he brought us together, and to us for finding the strength to forgive and move forward. Margaret clinked her glass against Sarah's, feeling a wave of emotion wash over her. To family, she added, in all its complex, messy, beautiful forms. As they left the restaurant, walking arm in arm under the starlit sky, both women felt a sense of closure. They had uncovered the truth about John, faced the pain of his choices, and emerged stronger for it. More importantly, they had found each other, an unexpected gift born from loss and deception. Their story, like life itself, didn't have a neat, tidy ending. There were still questions unanswered, wounds that were still healing. But as Margaret and Sarah made their way home, they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, bound not by blood but by choice, understanding, and love. The threads of their lives, once tangled and frayed, had been rewoven into a new pattern, one of resilience, forgiveness, and hope. And in that pattern, they had found a family neither had expected, but both now treasured above all else. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.